The plane was 30 minutes into the flight when Muhammad Ali unbuckled his seatbelt and walked to the back of the cabin. He stopped at a row where a man sat alone, staring at nothing. Ali said something too quiet for anyone else to hear. The man's face changed, not dramatically, just a slight shift that suggested recognition. They switched seats without another word. The flight attendants exchanged glances but didn't interfere. 3 hours later, the man who'd been sitting in Ali's seat walked off the plane and vanished. He never told anyone what Ali whispered to him that day. American Airlines Flight 447 from New York to Los Angeles, April 18, 1972. The 707 had been in the air since 10:15 a.m., climbing through clear skies over Pennsylvania, carrying 142 passengers and a crew of 8. It was an unremarkable Tuesday morning flight, the kind where business travelers read newspapers, families managed restless children, and solo passengers stared out windows at cloud formations that looked like nothing in particular. Muhammad Ali sat in seat 14C, an aisle seat in coach, not first class. He'd been offered the upgrade at check-in, but declined it. He was traveling alone, which was unusual. No entourage, no handlers, no Nation of Islam security. Just Ali, wearing dark sunglasses and a simple black suit, carrying a single leather bag that he'd placed in the overhead compartment himself. The flight attendants had recognized him immediately during boarding. One of them, a woman named Patricia Chen, who'd been flying this route for 6 years, had asked if he needed anything. Ali had smiled that famous smile and said he was fine, just needed to get to Los Angeles for a meeting. He didn't specify what kind of meeting. Patricia didn't ask. For the first 30 minutes of the flight, Ali sat quietly. He wasn't reading, he wasn't sleeping. He was just sitting, his hands folded in his lap, his head turned slightly toward the aisle. His stillness was notable because Muhammad Ali was never still. Everyone who knew him knew that. He was perpetual motion, constant energy, a man who filled rooms with his presence even when he wasn't speaking. But on this flight, he was different. Contained, almost absent. 7 rows behind Ali, in seat 21F, a man named David Brennan sat by the window, staring at nothing. Brennan was 34 years old, thin to the point of gaunt, with hollow cheeks and eyes that looked like they hadn't slept properly in months. He wore a grey suit that hung loose on his frame, suggesting recent weight loss. His hands rested on the armrests, fingers occasionally twitching in small, involuntary movements. A briefcase sat on the floor between his feet, unopened. He'd been one of the last passengers to board, walking down the aisle with his head down, not making eye contact with anyone. The passenger in the middle seat next to him, an elderly woman traveling to visit her daughter in Pasadena, had tried to make conversation after takeoff, asked where he was headed, what he did for work, the usual small talk that helps pass time on flights. Brennan had answered in monosyllables. Yes. No. Business. The woman had taken the hint and returned to her magazine. Brennan stared out the window at clouds that looked solid enough to walk on. His jaw was clenched. His breathing was shallow and controlled, the kind of breathing that comes from years of practice at keeping something contained. On his lap, hidden under a folded newspaper, his right hand held something small. Something he kept touching with his thumb, a repetitive gesture that might have been unconscious, or might have been the only thing keeping him tethered to the moment. That's when Muhammad Ali stood up. He didn't announce it. He simply unbuckled his seatbelt, rose from his seat, and began walking toward the back of the plane. Patricia, who was preparing beverage service in the forward galley, noticed immediately. She watched him move down the aisle with that distinctive Ali walk, smooth and purposeful. Not hurried, but not casual either. Ali walked past rows of passengers who didn't recognize him with his sunglasses on, past businessmen absorbed in spreadsheets, past a young couple holding hands across the armrest between them, past a woman knitting something blue. He moved with the certainty of someone who knew exactly where he was going, even though he'd never seen any of these passengers before boarding. He stopped at row 21. David Brennan didn't notice at first. He was still staring out the window, his focus somewhere beyond the clouds, beyond the present moment entirely. Then a shadow fell across him. He turned his head. Muhammad Ali stood in the aisle, looking down at him. The sunglasses were still on, But there was something in Ali's posture, in the slight tilt of his head, that conveyed a tension so complete it felt physical. For a long moment, neither man moved. The elderly woman in the middle seat looked up from her magazine, sensing something unusual happening in the space beside her. Then Ali leaned down, close enough that his voice wouldn't carry, close enough that only Brennan could hear. "I need you to do something for me," Ali said quietly. Brennan's face didn't change expression, but something happened behind his eyes. A flicker, a recognition. Not of Ali the celebrity, but of something else. Something in the words or the tone or the unexpected presence of this man standing in the aisle of a commercial flight asking for something. "What?" Brennan's voice was hoarse, barely audible. "I need you to sit in my seat for the rest of this flight." The request made no sense. The elderly woman had stopped pretending to read her magazine and was now openly watching this strange interaction. "Why?" Brennan asked. Ali didn't answer the question directly. Instead, he said, "Because where you're sitting right now, you can see too much. And where I'm sitting, you can see just enough." The words should have been cryptic, meaningless, but something in Brennan's face suggested they weren't. His hands, which had been still except for that repetitive thumb movement, went completely motionless. "You don't know me," Brennan said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement testing reality. "No," Ali agreed, "I don't know you." "Then how—" Brennan stopped. The question he was about to ask was too big for the moment. "Will you switch with me?" Ali asked again. The elderly woman started to say something, perhaps to ask if there was a problem, perhaps to offer to move herself, so these two men could sit together. But Ali raised his hand slightly, a gesture that was somehow both gentle and absolute, and she fell silent. Brennan looked at Ali for a long time, his jaw clenched and unclenched. His breathing changed rhythm. The thing he'd been holding under the newspaper, a small pill bottle, visible now in the shift of the paper, rolled slightly in his palm. Then Brennan unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. They didn't speak as they made the exchange. Ali waited in the aisle while Brennan gathered his briefcase and the folded newspaper with the pill bottle hidden inside. Then Brennan walked forward to seat 14C, his steps uncertain, like a man walking through a dream where the rules of physics keep changing. Ali slid into seat 21F by the window. He adjusted himself in the seat, buckled the belt, and then did something that several passengers would later remember. He removed his sunglasses and set them in the seat pocket in front of him. Without the glasses, his face was recognizable. The woman in the middle seat gasped softly, finally placing him. But Ali didn't acknowledge her reaction. He turned his head toward the window and looked out at exactly what David Brennan had been looking at for the past 30 minutes. Nothing and everything. Forward in seat 14C, David Brennan sat down and immediately felt the difference. The window was to his left now, not his right. He could see it in his peripheral vision, could see the clouds and the vast empty blue, but he wasn't looking directly at it anymore. Instead, he was facing the aisle, facing the constant movement of people, facing the flow of ordinary life happening around him. The flight attendants had noticed the switch. Patricia approached Ali in his new seat. "Mr. Ali, is everything all right? Would you like me to—" "I'm fine," Ali said quietly. "Thank you. If you'd like to move back to your original seat, or if you'd prefer first class, I can arrange—" "This is where I need to be," Ali said. His voice was gentle but final. Patricia nodded and moved on with her beverage cart, but she kept glancing back at row 21, troubled by something she couldn't name. For the next 3 hours, neither man spoke to anyone. Ali sat by the window in 21F, staring out at the clouds. His hands were folded in his lap. His breathing was slow and steady. The elderly woman beside him tried twice to start a conversation. Once to ask if he was really Muhammad Ali. Once to ask if she could have an autograph for her grandson. But both times Ali responded with such profound gentleness that she found herself apologizing for disturbing him without quite understanding why. Forward in 14C, David Brennan sat with his briefcase on his lap. The newspaper with the pill bottle was tucked inside now, out of sight. He stared at the seat back in front of him, but his eyes weren't focused on anything physical. His hands, which had been in constant small motion since boarding, were now completely still. At one point during the flight, a businessman across the aisle from Brennan leaned over and asked, "Excuse me, are you all right? You look like you might be feeling ill." Brennan turned to look at the man. For a moment, he seemed unable to process the question. Then he said, "I'm okay. Thank you. If you need anything, motion sickness pills, water, just let me know." "Thank you," Brennan repeated, "but I'm okay now." The businessman nodded and returned to his newspaper, missing the significance of that last word. Now. The flight continued over the Midwest, over the plains where the land stretched flat and endless below the clouds, over the Rockies where the plane gained altitude and the landscape became geometric shadows and white peaks. The captain announced they were making good time. The flight attendants served lunch. Life continued in the normal rhythms of commercial air travel. But in seat 21F, Muhammad Ali sat without moving, bearing witness to something only he could see through the window. And in seat 14C, David Brennan sat without moving, learning to look in a different direction. When the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Patricia made the standard announcement asking passengers to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. She noticed that both Ali and Brennan had never left theirs. They'd sat in their switched positions for the entire flight, 3 hours of absolute stillness in the middle of a cabin full of restless movement. The landing was smooth. The plane taxied to the gate. The seatbelt sign turned off with its familiar chime, and passengers immediately stood up, reaching for overhead compartments, eager to deplane after hours of confinement. Ali remained seated until most of the cabin had emptied. Then he stood, retrieved his single leather bag from the overhead compartment above row 14, where David Brennan still sat, and began walking toward the exit. As he passed seat 14C, he paused. Brennan looked up. Their eyes met. Ali said nothing. Brennan said nothing. The moment lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Ali continued walking. Patricia, standing by the exit door thanking passengers as they departed, watched this exchange. She would later tell her supervisor that something passed between the two men in that look. Something she couldn't articulate, but that felt important in a way that transcended normal passenger interactions. Ali walked off the plane and disappeared into the terminal. David Brennan sat in his seat for another 5 minutes after everyone else had gone. The cleaning crew was beginning to board when he finally stood up, gathered his briefcase, and walked off the plane on legs that looked uncertain about their purpose. Patricia would remember that he left the folded newspaper in the seat pocket. Later, when she was straightening the cabin before the next flight, she found it. The newspaper was 3 days old, dated April 15, 1972. Tucked inside was an empty prescription bottle. The label had been torn off. What Patricia didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that David Brennan had boarded Flight 447 that morning with no intention of getting off it alive. The pill bottle had contained 30 sleeping pills. He'd planned to take them somewhere over Kansas, while looking out the window at clouds that looked solid enough to hold him. He'd been sitting there for 30 minutes, building the courage to open the bottle, when Muhammad Ali had stood up and walked to the back of the plane. 15 years later, in 1987, a journalist named Carol Mendez was working on a book about Muhammad Ali's life outside the ring. She was interviewing people who'd encountered Ali in unexpected contexts, not in training camps or press conferences, but in ordinary moments of daily life. Someone gave her David Brennan's name. She almost didn't follow up on the lead. The information she'd been given was vague. A man who'd once switched seats with Ali on a plane. It didn't sound particularly interesting, but Carol was thorough. She tracked down Brennan, who was living in Portland, Oregon, working as a therapist, specializing in suicide prevention. She called him and explained she was writing about Ali. There was a long silence on the phone. "I'll meet with you," Brennan finally said, "but not for the book. Just for you to understand." They met at a coffee shop in downtown Portland on a gray afternoon in November. Brennan was 49 years old, healthier than in the photographs Carol had seen from 1972, but still carrying something in his eyes that suggested permanent acquaintance with darkness. "What happened on that flight?" Carol asked after the initial pleasantries. Brennan stirred his coffee for a long time before answering. "I was going to kill myself," he said finally. "Not dramatically. Not in a way that would traumatize anyone else. I was just going to take pills and go to sleep while looking out the window at 35,000 feet. I thought that would be peaceful." Carol waited. I'd lost everything that spring. My marriage, my business, my sense of who I was. I'd been planning it for weeks, bought a one-way ticket, wrote letters to people that I'd mailed the day before, filled the prescription for sleeping pills. I had it all figured out. What stopped you? Muhammad Ali stood up in the middle of the flight and asked me to switch seats with him. Why did that stop you? Brennan looked out the coffee shop window at rain beginning to fall. Because of what he said, and because of where he put me. What did he say? He said I was sitting somewhere I could see too much, and where he was sitting I could see just enough. Carol waited for elaboration. When it didn't come, she asked, what did that mean? I was sitting by the window, staring out at nothing, at clouds and empty space, at the void. That's all I could see. That's all I'd been seeing for months, emptiness. And sitting there, staring at that emptiness, taking those pills felt like the only logical thing to do. Brennan's voice was steady, clinical, the voice of someone who'd processed this moment professionally many times since. But when he moved me to the aisle seat, I couldn't stare at the void anymore. I was facing the cabin, I was facing people. I saw a mother trying to quiet a crying baby. I saw an elderly couple holding hands. I saw a flight attendant helping someone with luggage. I saw life continuing. Ordinary, messy, imperfect life. And that changed your mind? Not immediately. For the first hour in that seat, I was angry. I thought he'd ruined my plan. I was clutching that pill bottle under a newspaper, thinking about how to get back to a window seat, how to complete what I'd started. But I couldn't stop watching people. Couldn't stop seeing them living their small, ordinary moments. Brennan paused. Somewhere over Colorado, I started crying. Not sobbing, just quiet tears running down my face, because I realized I'd forgotten that life looked like that. I'd forgotten there was anything except the void. And sitting in that aisle seat, forced to look at people instead of emptiness, I remembered. Did Ali say anything else to you? No, when we landed and he walked past me on his way off the plane, he just looked at me. And in that look, I understood that he'd known. Somehow, without any explanation, without any conversation, he'd known what I was planning to do, and he'd known exactly how to stop me. Carol wrote this down carefully. How did he know? She asked. I've been asking myself that question for 15 years, Brennan said. I've developed theories. Maybe he saw me boarding and recognized something in my body language. Maybe he noticed how I was sitting. Maybe he saw the pill bottle. Maybe he's just one of those people who can sense when someone's drowning. Did you ever talk to him again? No, I wanted to. Many times over the years, I thought about writing him a letter or finding a way to meet him and say thank you, but I could never figure out how to explain what he'd done without it sounding insane. How do you tell someone they saved your life by asking you to switch seats? So you never told him he saved you? I think he knew, Brennan said quietly. That look when he walked past me before leaving the plane, it wasn't a look that needed an answer. It was a look that already knew. Carol's book was published in 1988. The story about the flight wasn't in it. She honored Brennan's request, but she kept her notes from that interview, and after Ali died in 2016, she published an essay about it in a literary magazine, changing Brennan's name to protect his privacy. The essay was called The Geography of Survival. In it, Carol wrote, Muhammad Ali understood something that November afternoon in 1972 that most people never learn. Sometimes saving someone's life isn't about dramatic intervention. It's about changing what they're looking at. It's about moving them from a place where they can only see the void to a place where they have to see other humans. It's about the quiet knowledge that perspective is everything, and sometimes all it takes is switching seats. The essay found its way to David Brennan, who by then was 63 years old and still working as a therapist. He called Carol. You used a pseudonym, but I recognized my story, he said. Thank you for telling it right. I hope I did, Carol said. Did I? Yes, there's just one thing you didn't include. One thing I didn't tell you in 1987 because I didn't understand it yet. What's that? For those 3 hours, sitting in Ali's seat, watching people live their lives, I kept thinking about what he'd said. About seeing too much versus seeing just enough. And I realized he wasn't just talking about what I could physically see through a window. He was talking about what I'd been doing to myself for months. What do you mean? I'd been looking at my life from too far away. From a perspective that made everything look meaningless. From a height where individuals disappear and nothing matters. That's what suicidal depression does. It gives you this terrible clarity where you can see how small and insignificant everything is. You see too much. You see the void. You see the ultimate emptiness of existence. Brennan's voice was thoughtful, measured. But Ali moved me to a place where I could see just enough, just the immediate, just the human scale, just enough life to remember why it matters, even if it doesn't matter in some cosmic sense. He took away my view of eternity and gave me back my view of Tuesday afternoon on a flight to Los Angeles. And that was enough to save me. Carol was quiet for a long time. "Did you ever figure out how he knew?" she asked. "Yes," Brennan said. "About 5 years ago, I was reading an interview with one of Ali's former cornermen. He was talking about how Ali would study opponents before fights. He said Ali could look at a man's eyes and know whether he was truly ready to fight or was just going through the motions. He said Ali could tell when a fighter had given up before the bell even rang. You think that's what he saw in you? I think Muhammad Ali spent his whole life reading people's eyes in contexts where life and death were metaphorical. In a boxing ring, when someone gives up, they lose a fight. But on that plane, Ali saw someone who'd given up in a way that meant something different, something final. And he responded the only way he knew how, by changing the fight. Changing the fight. Moving me from a position where I was fighting alone against infinity to a position where I was surrounded by reminders of why the fight matters. He didn't give me answers. He didn't give me hope. He just changed what I was looking at. And somehow that was enough. After Muhammad Ali died in June 2016, David Brennan made a donation to the Muhammad Ali Parkinson Center in Phoenix. The donation was substantial enough that the center's director called to thank him personally. "Did you know Ali?" the director asked. "We met once," Brennan said, "on a plane, April 18, 1972. "Did you talk about boxing?" "We didn't talk about anything, really. He just asked me to do something for him." "What was that?" "He asked me to sit in his seat." The director laughed, thinking this was a charming anecdote about celebrity generosity. "That was kind of him." "Yes," Brennan said, "it was the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me." David Brennan died in 2019 at the age of 81. In his will, he left instructions for his family to share one story at his funeral, not about his career as a therapist, not about the thousands of people he'd helped in his 40 years of practice, just one story about a Tuesday in April 1972 when Muhammad Ali stood up in the middle of a flight and asked a stranger to switch seats. His daughter told the story to a small gathering of family and colleagues. When she finished, she said, "My father spent the last 47 years of his life helping people who were sitting where he'd once sat, by a window, staring at the void, convinced there was nothing else to see. And he helped them the same way Muhammad Ali helped him, by showing them that sometimes survival is just about turning your chair in a different direction." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. Dad never got to thank Ali properly, but he spent every day of those 47 years thanking him through his work. Every person he helped was his way of saying, "Thank you for showing me that seeing just enough is better than seeing too much. Thank you for understanding that sometimes we need someone to change what we're looking at before we can change how we're living." The story made its way through therapeutic circles, shared among suicide prevention specialists as an example of intervention that defied standard protocols. Some criticized it as potentially reckless. What if Ali had been wrong? What if moving Brennan had made things worse? But others understood what Brennan had understood, that sometimes saving a life isn't about following procedures. It's about one human being seeing another human being with absolute clarity and responding with absolute certainty, even when that response makes no logical sense. Patricia Chen, the flight attendant who'd witnessed the seat switch, was interviewed by a documentary crew in 2017. She was 73 years old and had been retired from American Airlines for 20 years. "I remember that flight," she said when they asked about it. "I remember thinking something strange was happening, but not understanding what. I remember Ali sitting by that window for 3 hours, not moving, just staring out. And I remember the other man, I never knew his name, sitting in Ali's seat with this expression on his face like he was seeing the cabin for the first time. Did you ever figure out why they switched? Not for years. Not until I read that essay in 2016. Then I understood. Ali saw something no one else saw. He saw a man who needed to stop looking out and start looking in. And he made it happen without explanation, without drama. Just a quiet request that changed everything. What do you think that says about Ali? Patricia thought for a long time. I think it says that the greatest fights Muhammad Ali ever won weren't in boxing rings. They were in moments like that. Moments where he saw someone losing a private battle and intervened in ways that made no sense to anyone watching, but perfect sense to the person who needed help. That's real greatness, not the fights everyone saw, the ones no one understood until years later. The documentary never aired. Budget cuts ended the project before completion. But the interview exists in an archive somewhere, Patricia Chen's testimony to a moment in 1972 when Muhammad Ali stood up mid-flight and proved that sometimes the most important victories happen in aisle seats on Tuesday mornings over the middle of America. David Brennan never told anyone what Muhammad Ali whispered to him that day. When Carol Mendez asked in 1987, he said the words weren't what mattered. The action was what mattered. But his daughter found something after his death that suggested otherwise. In his desk drawer, tucked inside an old journal from 1972, was a piece of paper torn from an American Airlines cocktail napkin. On it, in shaking handwriting that looked like it had been written mid-flight, were 7 words. "You can see just enough now. Keep looking." That was what Ali had whispered, not a command, not advice, just an observation, a confirmation that Brennan had made the shift from seeing too much to seeing just enough, and an instruction to maintain that new perspective. Brennan had kept that napkin for 47 years, carried it with him through moves and job changes and all the accumulated life that followed. April 18, 1972. He never showed it to anyone, never mentioned it, just kept it as a private reminder that once, when he'd been sitting by a window planning his exit from life, someone had noticed and moved him to an aisle seat where he could see just enough to stay.